For many, though, the answer is simple: Allied inaction.
Why didn't the Allies make the rescue of European Jewry a war aim?
But was it really all so cut and dried, and have our leaders been unfairly criticised? The myth of rescue, that's our story tonight.
From Sydney, the ABC's Lateline. Here's Maxine McHugh.
Welcome to the program. On the face of it, it shouldn't be hard to pinpoint who's to blame for the Holocaust, one Adolf Hitler. But a brief trip through any major library might give a rather different answer. Through the 60s and 70s, a key group of historians, many of them American, set about promoting the view that Washington and London bear responsibility for at least the extent of the Holocaust. As one writer has said, there are now shelf loads of books demonstrating the Allies could have saved Jews from the Nazis. With the benefit of hindsight, it's now alleged that thousands more Jews should have been allowed to emigrate before and during the war. It's even been suggested that the Allies could have bombed concentration camps or paid a ransom for Jewish prisoners. But now this version of history is well and truly under attack. In a new book titled The Myth of Rescue, Bill Rubenstein contends that the Allied record in defence of the Jews is without parallel. It wouldn't surprise you to know that this attack on a modern orthodoxy has created a bit of a storm. In just a few minutes, we'll talk with Bill Rubenstein along with two other respected historians, but first this report from Fiona Clark.
I saw terrible things in the Warsaw Ghetto. Horrible, horrible. I saw a naked man lying on the street. So I asked my guide, what does it mean? He said, the Germans asked us to pay for the burial. So people were throwing on the street their own. I saw terrible things, I will never forget them.
Jan Karski holds a special place in history. As a messenger for the Polish government in exile, he was smuggled into the Warsaw Ghetto and an extermination camp so he could tell the world about the suffering of Polish Jews under the Nazi regime. In 1942, he got the chance to tell his story to British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, and several months later to President Roosevelt himself.
I remember, I emphasize, Mr. President, one has to make a distinction between the way the Germans treat my people and the Jewish people. With the Jews it is different. They want to destroy all of them physically.
Jan Karski found neither Roosevelt nor Eden had much interest in the Jewish question, more preoccupied with political matters, the carving up of Poland's borders to keep Stalin on side.
Those leaders I was talking to, they knew what was happening to the Jews. At that time, the basic war strategy had already been agreed upon.
That strategy was to defeat the Nazi war machine in the quickest possible time, without getting involved in what was then regarded as a side issue, the Holocaust. But the past 30 years have seen historians debating the soundness of that strategy. Could the Allies have done more to save Europe's Jews from torture and death at the hands of the Nazis?
If one looks at the papers in the Foreign Office, Jews were not a high priority. I wouldn't at the time have asked that Jews should be the highest priority. I would have asked that they be a priority, and the fact is that they were not.
But this view is challenged in a new book written by William Rubenstein. Titled The Myth of Rescue, it argues the Allies made every effort to save the Jews. Attacking 30 years of what he calls revisionist history, Rubenstein claims Allied refugee policy was sympathetic toward the Jews. That in the period leading up to the war, no one knew of Hitler's genocidal intentions, and that no rescue plan talked about would ever have worked. For John Fox, a lecturer in Jewish studies, Rubenstein's book is like a breath of fresh air.
In this Foreign Office telegram, dated 26th of February 1943, to the State Department in Washington, you have encapsulated the single most important point which determines Allied policy towards Nazi Third Reich and the Jewish question in Europe. I'll read it. The blunt truth is that the whole complex of human problems raised by the present German domination of Europe, of which the Jewish question is an important but by no means the only aspect, can only be dealt with completely by an Allied victory. And any step calculated to prejudice this is not in the interests of Jews in Europe. The claim by some that Britain and America were responsible or culpable for the Holocaust is an absolute damned lie.
This view has incensed Professor Alderman.
There is one question that any writer on this subject about the Holocaust should ask. Why didn't the Allies make the rescue of European Jewry a war aim? That question is never addressed in this book.
While that question may not be addressed directly, the book does assess the feasibility of wartime rescue plans, including the bombing of Auschwitz and the trading of goods for Jewish lives.
Any idea that you could sort of waltz in and offer some quick deal with the Nazis and somehow pull out the Jews and presumably let them get on with the war with the Soviet Union is really ridiculous. And Rubinstein is rather good at demolishing that sort of thing.
Perhaps the most contentious element of the book is Rubinstein's defence of Allied refugee policy. He cites the fact that 70% of German Jews escaped death by fleeing before the war as evidence of successful policy. But Geoffrey Alderman disagrees.
There was a prejudice against rescuing Jews as Jews.
He says that prejudice allowed Britain to keep the doors shut to immigrants to Palestine at a time when they needed them open the most. He also claims that Allied Jewish communities failed their European counterparts by not putting enough pressure on their governments to increase refugee quotas.
I myself have examined synagogue records in London. It is quite clear that German Jewish refugees were unwanted and unwelcome. Astonishingly, there was prejudice against German Jewish refugees by Jews born in Britain.
That's a view that's rejected by Walter Jonah, who vividly remembers his father's efforts on behalf of the Jews.
They lobbied extremely hard. I remember many of those meetings in my home and in other homes, but the very big difference between what they did in those days and what is done today is that they did it privately and quietly and unobtrusively and didn't seek ego recognition as a result of their efforts.
Whether the Allies could have done more to save the Jews from Hitler's final solution is a question that's haunted debate ever since the war. The images of Jewish suffering have haunted Jan Karski.
I tried not to have any sentiments. If I reacted sentimentally, I would have become mad 100 times.
That report from Fiona Clark, and now to my guests. Bill Rubinstein is the author of The Myth of Rescue. He was formerly with the History Department at Deakin University in Geelong, but currently holds a professorship at the University of Wales, Aberystwyth. Professor David Cesarani is director of the Wiener Library in London. From 1987 to 1992, he was a consultant to Britain's All-Parliamentary War Crimes Group, which successfully pressed for a UK War Crimes Act. Dr. Tony Kushner is Senior Lecturer in Jewish, Non-Jewish Relations at the History Department of Southampton University. He's published what is regarded as the leading study on British and American responses to the Holocaust. And all of our guests join us tonight from London. So, gentlemen, welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us. Bill Rubinstein, you've written a book which certainly appears to absolve the Allies. I'm just wondering, can history really be that black and white?
No, it isn't. History is ambiguous, and in particular for the actors concerned in any historical event. You must remember that nobody can see the future. And events which now seem to be matters of history, well known to us, were unknown at the time and could not have been known at the time. And that is something which must be kept in mind when discussing matters of rescuing Jews from the Nazis.
But I think I'm right in saying that your book pretty well gives the Allies a tick on this question of possible rescue of Jews. I mean, I'm just wondering, such a shocking event that really defined this century in many ways, Doesn't this question of Allied effort always have to be something of an open question?
Well, it is an open question, of course, and my book is simply a contribution to the debate. But you must remember that before the war, my thesis is that the Allies, the democracies, did a rather good job, considering all things considered, in getting Jews out of Germany. And Hitler was only in power in Germany until just before the war started. After the war started, when Hitler invaded and conquered Europe, the Jews became unreachable and could not be rescued by the Allies. And this is often forgotten.
Why did you feel the need to write a corrective on some of the scholarship?
It dawned on me about 4 or 5 years ago when I was reading the literature of this subject that it was entirely wrong. That everything that literally every historian had written about the subject of rescue in the last 30 years, or virtually every historian, was egregiously inaccurate. It assumed that there were ways of rescuing Jews once the war started, which were not pursued. And in fact, searching for a plan of rescue that would have succeeded, made during the war anywhere in the English-speaking world, became for me a kind of holy grail. And I have in my office something like 3,000 pages of photostated materials, most of which relate to plans for rescue or things relating to that, which were made during the Second World War. In the end, I couldn't find this holy grail. Like most holy grails, it was unobtainable. And in fact, no plan for rescue made during the war, in my view, could have rescued any significant number of Jews.
David Cesarani, one would have to say quite a few of the reviews of Bill Rubenstein's book have said this view of history, of this particular event, is long overdue.
Well, the reviews have been very markedly split. And I think that it's not unfair to say that those who have worked in the archives on the material, who are familiar with the subject intimately, have had very severe reservations about this book and have regarded it less as a serious contribution to research than as a polemic, and at times a very crude and violent polemic at that, one that attacks fellow historians in quite savage terms, and one that also, although it claims to eschew hindsight, attacks historical figures, actors in this historical narrative, in a way that I think many historians would find very uncomfortable. The great British historian Tawney said that the historian is not a hanging judge, but I'm afraid that looking at Bill Rubenstein's book, one is constantly coming across gallows from which dangle historians and historical actors.
I'll come back to some of those points, but I mean, as to the central question, I mean, could the Allies have done more? I mean, in your view, is that a resounding yes or a very qualified yes?
I think Bill Rubenstein is quite right that some of the wilder, mainly journalistic accounts of Allied responses to the Nazi persecution of the Jews, both before and during the Second World War, have been biased. They have grossly overstated what might have been achieved, and they have caricatured the Allied leaders, notably Roosevelt and Churchill. But Bill Rubenstein goes in quite the opposite direction when he says that prior to 1939, the Western democracies had a generous refugee policy, and that there was even an international effort to save the Jews, and that after 1939, nothing could be done in any case. I think it's close to the truth to say that before 1939, there were many possibilities for getting Jews out of Germany, long after it became clear that the Nazi regime was bent on a murderous policy, a discriminatory policy of extreme severity, if not a genocidal one, and opportunities that were not taken. And that for a couple of years after the beginning of the Second World War, there were also opportunities to get Jews out of Central Europe, areas already occupied by Germany, which were not taken, and which were actually obstructed, particularly by the British, who feared that any Jews getting out of Nazi-occupied Poland, Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia would head for Palestine. And this has been well documented, and there is not a single piece of documentary evidence in Bill Rubenstein's book that thwarts the arguments of those esteemed historians like Bernard Wasserstein, who have charted particularly the nefarious methods used by the British in the latter part of 1939 and during 1940 and the early part of 41 to stop Jews getting out of Europe at a time where they could have got out.
Well, let me
because it was feared by the British they would go to Palestine.
Right. Let me ask you just quickly, what do you mean by those nefarious means? David?
Well, for example, the British put pressure on the Yugoslav government during 1940 to prevent Jews getting down the Danube on refugee boats, either individually or on boats that they had chartered. Many hundred were actually trapped in Yugoslavia at the time when Yugoslavia was invaded by the Germans. Those Jews were later exterminated by the Germans. Now, the British were not to know that the Germans would put those Jews to death, but they certainly knew that they wanted to stop them getting down the Danube to the Black Sea and getting onto ships that might carry them to Palestine. And the British Foreign Office exerted every muscle it had to prevent the then independent Belgrade government from allowing the passage through Yugoslavia of these Jewish refugees. And that is just one of many cases.
All right, Bill Rubenstein, can I get your response to that?
Yes, well, very simply, David put his finger on it. The genocide of the Jews, the killing of the Jews, began in June 1941. It spread to, that is in the Soviet Union, it spread to Poland and other parts of Nazi-occupied Europe in the early part of 1942. And the policy of genocide became known in Britain and America in the latter part of 1942. When the policy, we're talking now about the period that David's just discussed before.
Well, we're actually splitting hairs, Bill.
We're not splitting hairs, there's a crucial distinction.
We know, and the Allies knew, that as soon as the Germans had overrun Poland, large-scale massacres of Jews took place. Now, this was not the final solution, but it was quite clear from early 1938, when the Germans marched into Austria and humiliated and beat up, and often, in many cases, murdered Jews, that this was a savage regime. You didn't need the final solution to realize that the Jews in Europe were in desperate need of aid that was never forthcoming from the Western democracies.
The Jews of Eastern Europe who were the Jews of Eastern Europe were unreachable at this time by the Allies. Furthermore, there is a big difference between what was done as appalling as it is in Poland and so on in 1940 and 1941 and the actual killing of Jews. May I continue? When the genocide, the actual killing process of Jews in Europe was known, the Allies reacted to that in a variety of ways. One was that no Jew who escaped from Nazi-occupied Europe was ever turned back after 1941, so far as I know. And there was a remarkably generous process of receiving these people. The problem is they could not get out. Now, this is the crucial point. The barriers to Jewish emigration from Nazi-occupied Europe were erected by the Nazis themselves from mid-1940 onwards.
This is factually incorrect.
This is the
until the German army occupied Vichy France in November 1942, Jews were leaving from the port of Marseille and other parts of Vichy France continuously.
That's true.
And I know this from my own research, and attempts were made in Britain, in the United Kingdom, to get the British government and the American government to help organize the exit of German Jewish refugees, other Jewish refugees in Vichy France, to safe havens. Every attempt to do so was stopped.
This was stopped in the end by Laval and the French regime,
well,
acting on the orders of the Nazis prior to genocide. When it was possible for Jews to emigrate from Nazi-occupied Europe, almost by definition, this was a time before the actual killing of Jews had started.
Okay,
Bill, are you seriously?
Okay, gentlemen, I'd like to bring Tony Kushner in on this point. Tony, how do you see this question of the generosity or otherwise of the Allies in the period leading up to, say, 1941, throughout the 30s, for instance?
Well, and I'm pleased that Bill used the word ambiguous, because that's the first time I've ever heard him use that term. What we see in the 1930s, I think, is a mixed policy. We see generosity and meanness, and it often comes from the same people. If one takes one of the examples that Bill really stresses as the issue of generosity, the movement of children, and that a large percentage of the children from Greater Germany were rescued before the start of war. When one looks at it in actual cold detail, what happened was, if you take the British example, 10,000 children eventually were settled in Britain on a temporary basis. But what happened to their parents? Is this generosity or is it meanness? Those involved, the parents, the children, And certainly the government and the refugee organisations were very, very aware that these children may never see their parents again. It was a muddled policy. It was a mixture of, as I say, of generosity, but also meanness of spirit. But I think there's an assumption that refugees, both then and now, are a problem. That was the perception of the British government. The idea being that refugees coming into Britain would take jobs. In fact, we now know that they created over 100,000 jobs in Britain alone. So again, it was the way they were looking at refugees, and particularly their Jewishness, as problematic. They were going to bring with them anti-Semitism.
In fact, I was just going to say, to what extent do you think anti-Semitism drove the immigration policies? The generosity or otherwise?
Again, we need... Sure, we need to be very careful what we mean by anti-Semitism. I think we're talking within the context of a liberal democracy. And this idea that refugees would bring with them, and that's the sort of phrase that was used at the time, would bring with them anti-Semitism, was very much the perspective of government ministers, and to an extent the refugee organisations. They were paranoid about anti-Semitism, I think overly worried about it. And that fear of anti-Semitism being the fault of the Jews themselves, I think is one of the great factors stopping rescue in the 1930s and beyond. And it's a nonsense to say that everything totally changes in September 1939. There is a grey period, which goes on almost right through the war, where certain numbers of Jews are able to come to safety. And again, the reason the British government, one of the major reasons the British government throughout the war says that they will not accept Jewish refugees is this fear of anti-Semitism. It comes from Conservative ministers, from Labour ministers. It's right across the board.
Bill, do you think that's right?
It's not a genocidal form of anti-Semitism. It's an anti-Semitism, I think, rooted on ambivalence, that a large influx of foreign Jews would cause problems.
Bill?
No, I think his answer is very wrong. In 1919, Britain enacted what is known as the Aliens Order Act, which removed any legal definition of a refugee from British law. Very few, if virtually no refugees were allowed to come to Britain in the interwar period. There were millions of refugees in the world. They came from Greece, from Russia, all those white Russian good anti-communists. You think the conservative governments of the interwar period would have loved to admit them by the hundreds of thousands. Virtually none were allowed in. The only exception to this exclusionary policy toward refugees that was made in the interwar period was in favor of German Jews in the 1930s, which was very remarkable. And this was because, in my view, of a very considerable amount of elite philo-Semitism and admiration for Jews, and also because of the disgust felt by almost everyone in Britain at the brutal way in which Jews were being treated by the Nazis from the newsreels, etc., etc. Now, of course, in hindsight, it looks bad. In hindsight, it looks like we missed all these opportunities to rescue the Jews, but you must remember that there was no policy of genocide. There was simply a policy by Hitler of kicking out the Jews, and even that wasn't clear until Kristallnacht in 1938.
If I may just
Indeed, there was, absolutely.
Before Tony. Bill doesn't actually understand the Aliens Act of 1919 or the subsequent effect of the 1920 order. The reason that so few refugees were able to come to Britain in the 1920s and early 1930s, and he mentions the case of Armenians and White Russians, is that to get into the country, you either had to have a large amount of capital, which few refugees had, you had to have a job waiting for you, which was very difficult if you were an Armenian coming from war-torn Caucasus, or if someone was going to guarantee you. Now, the reason that thousands of Jews were able to enter Britain up until 1938 was because the Jewish community guaranteed them. The Jewish community paid for them to be allowed into the country. And in that sense, the Jewish community is singular. The only thing it proves, and this I think reinforces what Dr. Kushner was saying, that the British government felt that it could not defend to its own people the immigration of even a few thousand refugees if they were perceived as being a burden on the public purse or a threat to the jobs of Englishmen. So the Jewish community had to be able to say, we're paying for these people to come here, they're not going to compete in the job market. And as Tony said, the most tragic result of this is that the British government could admit about 9,000 or 10,000 children, but not their parents, because it was feared that their parents would compete on the job market. And that is the kind of niggardly policy. It's pragmatic, sure, but you cannot say it's humane. It's a niggardly policy, it's split families, and I think it is a black mark on Britain's history at a time when it was quite clear that Jews remaining in Germany were being treated desperately badly.
Tony, let me just pose, if I can, we are running out of time, let me just pose the question that was put in our introductory tape, and that is, once it became clear what was happening in Europe, in Germany after 1941, 1942, should the Allies have made the rescue of European Jewry a war aim, or were they correct, in fact, in their decision to say the best thing we can do for European Jewry is to win the war? Tony?
In November 1939, Chaim Weizmann, the Zionist leader, approached the Foreign Secretary in Britain and said, I would like you to make this a war aim, a specific war aim of the saving of European Jews, and was told categorically no. This would single out the Jews, it would lead to anti-Semitism. Right along, Jewish campaigners wanted to single out the Jews, and essentially everything the government did was reactive. There was no body, either British or American, set up until the War Refugee Board. The War Refugee Board was created out of really blackmail of Roosevelt, who was told that unless he created somebody that had a specific aim of helping save Jewish lives, that the role of the State Department in suppressing news about the final solution, about suppressing possibilities of rescue, that this would come out in what was seen to be an election year. And so what we see is a reactive policy, that this is never a priority of government. And had it not been for the campaigners, it would not have been an issue at all. When the campaigners start put pressure, then we start to see some liberalisation and some saving of some Jews. Bill said at the end of his book that no significant number of Jews could be rescued. What does he mean by significant? Even if a few Jews have been saved, surely this would have exonerated the Allies, and that they would have tried. What they did not do until the War Refugee Board is to explore the possibilities of rescue. They were not interested in them.
Bill, just a final comment on that, if you could.
Well, it's completely wrong. If you go through the policies of rescue that were actually proposed during the war in the democracies, they are useless. They couldn't have rescued anybody. And let us come back to the central and absolute point. The Jews of Nazi-occupied Europe after 1939 and 1940 were prisoners of a psychopath, Adolf Hitler, whose life mission was to kill all of them. They were his prisoners. The only way you could rescue them, or any significant number of them whatsoever, was to defeat Adolf Hitler. He bears the sole responsibility for the Holocaust, not the democracies.
Oh, gentlemen, on that note, I'll have to say thank you very much for joining us tonight. Thank you.
Those leaders I was talking to, they knew what was happening to the Jews. At that time, the basic war strategy had already been agreed upon.